Hey Sam, thanks for talking to me. You are now a student at American University in Beirut. What are you studying there?
Hey T, great to hear from you. Yeah, I'm really glad to be able to help you out and do a guest post for your blog. Um, uh, that's right. I am here in Beirut, studying at the American University of Beirut. I'm doing a semester here, studying political science and some Middle Eastern history. Taking classes on politics in Israel and the Palestinian territories, politics in Lebanon, and a class on Arab political theory, in addition to some history stuff.
So Lebanon might be interesting given what's going on in Syria right now. But I think to really understand Lebanon, you really have to understand a little bit of its history. It has a pretty tumultuous history, correct?
Oh yeah, I mean, as most people know, Lebanon suffered a civil war that went on from 1975 till 1990, so 15 years of war. Of course, it wasn't sort of one monolithic conflict, but sort of broken down into several stages. It was affected by internal factors, a civil war that was sort of on Muslim Christian lines, to be very simplistic, and then later, there was Syrian and other Arab intervention, Western intervention, and the Israeli invasion of 1982. And talking about Lebanon today in the context of this Arab Spring, for lack of a better term, is you have to remember that Lebanon is a very small country that, in many ways, acts as a mirror for larger currents or forces in the Middle East. Lebanon, this is due to Lebanon's size, its geographic location, and the fact that it is a very weak state, and its demographic and sociopolitical makeup.
What makes it a
So let's talk about
what makes it a weak state?
so Lebanon's system of government, it can be classified as it's called a confessional, or they have a confessional system, and it's the theory it most sort of ascribes to in terms of its formal political structure is a consociational democracy. So it's because it is a very fractured society. It's a mosaic of a society. You have I think it's somewhere around 18 or 21 or 23, some number like that, of different officially recognized sects. And these sects in Lebanon are each basically comprised of different religious minority communities. And because there's so many of them, and because there's no clear population majority of any sect, the government is based on a weak sort of power sharing agreement and between these sects, so that to rule, to ensure that there's no one group that's interests are seen to before all any other groups. Of course, the downside to this sort of setup is, yeah, okay, everybody gets represented, everybody gets a piece of the pie, but uh, um, it effectively gives each sect or a group of sects a mutual veto over one another. They're
So
not, and it precludes the government from being able to, sort of tackle difficult issues or make real progress or engage in any sort of meaningful policy shifts.
So, although there are about 20 different recognized sects, there has to be a few major players in Lebanese politics. Who might that be? Obviously, the Hariri government, but who else?
Okay, so the Hariri government is the Hariri government was dominated by a large umbrella coalition of different political parties known as March 14. March 14, the name dates back to a protest that was held on March 14, 2005, which resulted in Syrian troops being evicted after like 20 years of occupation in Lebanon. And in that group, it's actually not very, if you look back to the Civil War, the people who are together in that group are not necessarily natural partners or longtime allies in Lebanon.
Hmm.
It's mostly made up of traditionally right-wing Maronite Christian groups,
Hmm.
parties like El Quwa Lebaniyeh, which translates to the Lebanese Forces, and the Kataib, which is headed by the Gemayel family. You've heard of like Bashir Gemayel, who was killed in 1982 or 1983. I'm not 100% sure on that.
Yeah.
That family's traditionally been very powerful Maronite
So
family.
you have the March
El
14th,
Quwa,
you have the March 14th coalition, and then right now it's the March 8th coalition, correct? Is that the other
right?
opposing
So
coalition?
Yes, in 2000, yeah, at the very beginning of this year, like January 12th, March 8th, which is also, it's actually annoying how similar the names are. Like it's like they couldn't pick better dates that were a little bit more different sounding. But they were their coalition's named after a demonstration they held March 8th of that year, where they were sort of demonstrating solidarity and thanks for Syria for preserving stability in Lebanon. The major players in that coalition are also, it's not exactly a natural grouping of people. It's Michel Aoun, who's actually a Maronite. It is Hezbollah, under Hassan Nasrallah, obviously. Groups like Amal, which is another Shia group like Hezbollah, and the SSNP, which is the Syrian Socialist Nationalist Party, and a bunch of other lesser parties that I don't know their names and aren't incredibly important for our purposes here today.
But the March 14th coalition is generally seen as a stronger ally of the West and Saudi Arabia, and March 8th more so of Hezbollah and their side, correct?
That's absolutely correct. And just like I was saying earlier, the way Lebanon is often a mirror for sort of larger political currents in the region, these two coalitions are absolutely, I don't want to say proxies, but they're certainly, big. They're hugely supported by external forces. That's right. On March 14 is largely supported by Saudi Arabia, and especially the Hariri's party, Tayar Mustaqbal, is supported by. Saudi's a huge patron of them, as well as France and the U.S. were sort of backing March 14, largely because of their anti-Hezbollah line and their opposition to Hezbollah's weapons. March 8, on the other hand, does enjoy the backing of Syria, and because Hezbollah takes a lot of its funding from Iran, they are also seen as large supporters of March 8.
So you mentioned Syria. So moving forward, Syria's in the middle of its own uprising. No one really knows what might happen there, whether it'll go pro-Assad or the regime will fall. What are people saying in Lebanon? What implications might this have, and how are people reacting?
So here's the thing, Teek. I think either way, it's going to have huge implications for Lebanon. The Syrians have always seen Lebanon as part of Syria, and it wasn't until the 19th century that Lebanon was even considered a distinct unit of analysis when looking at the Middle East, separate from Syria. It's historically been part of the region, and it's you've been here, you know how close it is from Beirut to Damascus. Mm-hmm. It's a 2-hour drive. What I would say, my guess is as good as any in terms of what's going to happen in Syria, but I think overall you're going to see if real moves towards democracy are made in Syria, you're going to see a true improvement in relations between Beirut and Damascus. You're going to see increased cooperation. It's going to be less suspicion, less Syrian intelligence penetration in Lebanon. Sort of more open ties and exchange between the two.
Would it weaken the March 8th coalition and embolden the March 14th?
Yes, I think it's never good to look at these things in terms of a zero-sum game.
Exactly.
But I would say, rather than it being good for March 14, I would say that Hezbollah stands the most to lose. Mm-hmm. Because Syria is so distracted by its domestic strife right now, and hypothetically, if the Assad regime were to fall, I think the big outcome there is Hezbollah is going to be increasingly nervous, and whether or not it would certainly be a blow to Hezbollah, but how it manifests itself is just as unclear as what's going to happen in Syria. It's going to if it's going to give March 14 the leverage they need to come back into power, or if it's going to make Hezbollah feel as though it's been backed into a corner and thus a more dangerous, more marginalized group. That could be just as likely an outcome.
So, given Hezbollah has so much to lose, is anyone talking about Hezbollah's involvement in the Syrian uprising? Are they helping out, or are there any rumor? I don't want to operate just on rumors, but any ideas?
You know what? Not that I've heard.
Okay.
I obviously don't have my my ear to the ground. I'm not connected as much as others, but. The prevailing, from what I've heard, no, there hasn't been that obviously they don't want to see their patron state fall. I mean, Syria is their economic lifeline. It's their lifeline for arms transfers, for funding, for
Mm-hmm.
and, they send a lot of their troops to Syria and Iran to train. It would certainly be a blow, but to what extent and to how they would respond to a regime change in Syria remains unclear. Yeah.
So have you seen, or is Lebanon taking any moves to change their relationship with Israel, given everything that's going on, or vice versa?
You know, Lebanon, because of history, because of Israel's history of aggression in Lebanon since the late '70s with the Litani operation, anti-Israel sentiment in Lebanon is very, very, very high, even by Middle East, even by Arab world standards. I would argue that I would argue that you're not going to see any rapprochement between Lebanon and Israel anytime soon, unless it's under the auspices of a Syria-Israel peace deal or some sort of comprehensive deal.
Now,
it's politically, as it is elsewhere in the Arab world, it's politically very popular to be anti-Israel, and in Lebanon, it's not an unfounded sentiment.
So, have you seen any? Moving on a little bit, have you seen any signs of any sort of uprising or popular movement inside Lebanon itself? I don't know who they might uprise against, but
in this sort of since January, with the beginning of these popular uprisings throughout the region, it has had a marginal effect in Lebanon. March 14 had their big rally to commemorate the death of Rafiq Hariri. And the original March 14 rally in 2005, turnout was lower than expected. There have been small protests, especially there's been a protest movement against the sectarian system, which is very interesting. But it's been criticized by a lot of Sunni and Christians in Lebanon as a sort of a Shia power grab, because they stand the most to gain from the abolishment of the sectarian system, simply because their population has grown the most in recent years. So their position would be enhanced by abolishing the sectarian system. The other protests that you see here, there was one or two small pro-Assad protests organized by the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, but not there's been no mass protests here. But you also have to remember that Lebanon's problems aren't the same problems that are faced by a lot of these, by a lot of Arab populations under, authoritarian rule. That's not to say Lebanon doesn't have its own problems. It's not to say that a lot of the economic problems that are faced in other parts of the Arab world aren't shared here. But the feeling of needing to reassert that sort of collective dignity of the people, that feeling of wanting an accountable and transparent government and wanting a voice in government, I don't think is the most immediate desire here, because for all its failings, Lebanon is it is a democracy. It doesn't function very well, but people do have a say in their government.
So you were saying that it's been kind of in a stalemate since the March 8th coalition took over. Do you see that breaking anytime soon?
Like I said, a lot of this I think is actually quite contingent on what happens in Syria.
Okay.
Given a regime change, given the fall of the Assad regime in Damascus, you will see opportunities for March 14 to reassert itself, but it's by no means clear cut, or by no means certain that they would be able to do so. Najib Miqati, who's the businessman from Tripoli, who's been tasked with forming the next government as PM, he was March 8th's choice. He's been struggling for 5 months now. Almost 5 months now to form a cabinet, and it doesn't show any signs of abating.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us. It looks like there's, like everywhere in the Middle East, more questions than answers at this point. But we will keep watching.
Sounds great. Thanks for your time, Teek.
Yep. Bye.